Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stu Solomon. I'm the CEO of Human. Human is a really fascinating cybersecurity company that spans kind of areas of what we consider to be risk, fraud, and cybersecurity, all kind of coming together in a story that I'm going to tell you a little bit about right now. I just joined I just joined Human from Recorded Future back in January, and I'm still getting my feet wet as I learn the different ins and outs of the solution. But I'm going to walk you through a little bit about kind of why I'm here, the strategy behind what the company is going after, and how you could think about components of the broader, let's call it, digital risk environment that you probably don't think about a lot through a traditional cybersecurity lens. And just for a little bit of context, I've been in the security space for the better part of about 30 years, doing so on the military side of the house. I've been in banking, I've been on the vendor space, I've kind of been everywhere in between. And Human represents the thing that I think matters most to all of us as security professionals, which is, what do you do with data? What story is that data telling you if you're able to harness it effectively? And much more importantly, how do you create a higher order analytic to be able, with some level of confidence, to automate and orchestrate your way into adding enough friction in the process to slow down, impose cost, or completely dissuade adversary activity and intent? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So to set the stage just a little bit, I'm going to talk about something that's so blatantly obvious. Turns out that there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the world right now. So in the digital space, and these numbers are really important, and I ask you to kind of take a step back and think about them for just a second. We're talking about over 5 billion people on the internet on a daily basis. Now why does that 5 billion number matter? At Human, we're actually seeing nearly 3 billion unique device IDs on a weekly basis, meaning that we're touching nearly 20 trillion digital interactions on a weekly basis. So trillions and trillions upon digital interactions that we're seeing every single day. But where do we get them from? I'll talk to you a little bit about that in just a second. But keep those numbers in mind. The attack surface is really massive. Now, ultimately, this becomes a fight between the good guys and the bad guys that's all about speed and action. And that speed and action can always be accelerated on either side of the equation through the use of automation. And when you start to talk about automation and you're looking at things through the lens of a malicious actor, what are you really talking about? You're really talking about bot activity. And at the very core of what Human is and what Human does is to start to think about things through that lens of understanding this really fundamental and basic notion of, is the traffic that I'm seeing originating from a bot or not? Is it human or not human? Is it the right human or the wrong human? Each one of those fundamental questions are at the very fore of the technical component that we're trying to solve, but we're trying to solve it by looking at things through a very basic lens of scale and speed with some level of consistent outcomes associated with it. So we're making these decisions of bot or not, human or not, right human or not, in tenths of a millisecond, trillions of times a day, across billions of device IDs. So as you start to think about the bot problem in a much more holistic sense, you know, if you grew up like I did in the early days of the various, let's call it antisocial behaviors of things like the anonymous movement, you start to equate bot activity with DDoS. Well, DDoS is an easy way to wrap your mind around what a bot could potentially do, but the reality is there are very good bots and there are very bad bots, and all of us use bot activity in some form or fashion to be able to deal with the huge volumes of data that we're all dealing with every day, as well as the orchestration automation of processes that happen for both legitimate purposes and illegitimate purposes. So being able to make that correlation and make that decision very fast around what is good or bad as it relates to bot activity is a fundamentally important component of solving this overall equation. Now, obviously, outside of any kind of DDoS scenarios, which are very easy to start to dismiss as kind of commoditized use case that I think all of us have dealt with over the years, we're also starting to get into much more modern applications of bot activity to be able to do the thing that bad guys like to do most of all, which is be lazy and create an effect at scale. And that effect at scale can be achieved through bot activity, not just through the actors themselves, but actually through the use of amplification of their capabilities for bot as a service activities, which does one thing that I think matters more than anything else. It lowers the barrier to entry for activity to occur. In other words, I could have nothing more than, to borrow a concept from the New York Lottery from when I was a kid, this idea of $1 in a dream. Well, if I have a dollar in a dream and access to the web, I can find somebody who's going to be creating bot armies, going to be hurting those bots, going to make those bots available, creating panels to be able to control those bots, and ultimately to create an outcome that's outsized from my own capability from a maturity perspective, as well as my own capability from a technical perspective, to be able to target any number of different scenarios, ultimately leading to everything from disruptive capabilities to influence operation scenarios as well, and everything in between. So there's an angle here worth considering. As we start to look at this, how does it manifest itself on the attack surface in a way that we should all care about? There's a couple of shocking numbers here. So I talked about kind of the very grandiose stage that we're operating on when you look at the amount of people and amount of activity and amount of devices that are on the internet. But this is just a small slice of what we're actually seeing and touching day in and day out, just in our install base, in our client base itself. 26 billion fraudulent login attempts blocked in just 1 year. You can imagine the impact that that has to basic e-commerce activity on a daily basis. This also starts to become, frankly, the nexus between the internet and an identity and access management problem, which we could probably talk about a lot more on the side. But the number that I always jump at that I think is just absolutely insane, there was a particular, let's call it large-scale retailer that we probably all have done business with probably today, that 99% of the traffic that they were seeing was originating from bot activity in the first place. I'll give you another example. We're working with a very large, let's call it online gaming environment that probably most of us have season passes to. We're seeing that over 90% of the traffic hitting that gateway to come on into the door and both establish an account or to authenticate with a credential of some sort is actually emulating from bot activity in the first place as well. Just absolutely staggering numbers that we have to address. So, I'll save this for another time, but I'll plant the seed for just a second, only because I don't have a ton of time up here today. But the activity associated with bot scenarios starts and stops with the ability to create an amplifying effect. I'll just throw out there kind of the far side of the equation here. Before you get to creating, whether it's account takeover scenarios or scraping scenarios or fraudulent transactional behaviors perpetrated by bot activity, we should always think about how the bots are creating that amplifying effect in the first place. And there's a whole conversation to be had around residential proxies that we should probably talk about. So using many of our own devices, whether they're in our networks or they're in our home environments or they're just in connected environments in general, to be able to create unwitting victims, which ultimately allow for the amplification effect that you can never get to scale on your own. I'll save that for another day, but here's kind of the meat of the conversation that I'd love to talk about for a second. So the normal way to start to think about a account takeover scenario is in a digital e-commerce environment or digital world. What do? You get attracted to a particular brand or brand equity. That brand equity makes you want to go into an environment and set up an account. You set up that account, and as soon as you set up that account, you get served by a series of challenges to determine if you are a human being or if you're a bot. And I think most of us have seen some of those challenges in the past. It could equate to something like a CAPTCHA challenge that says, tell me if there are stairs in these 5 pictures or not, show me the crosswalk, let me see the bicycle. And we slow down long enough to be challenged by predetermined patterns of behavior, and also to take a deeper inspection at the infrastructure and activity associated with behavioral patterns that you're demonstrating while you're interacting with that challenge that's on the screen in front of you. That friction that's created is really a mechanism to be able to start to collect more information, to pass judgment on the legitimacy of the transactional behavior that you're trying to accomplish. But what does it really do to each one of us? What it really does is it just annoys us, right? It annoys us. It's highly difficult to work through, even if you are a legitimate human being trying to create an outcome, and therefore it starts to affect the thing that matters most to the people that are presenting this to you in the first place, which is your brand affinity. It takes you away from that ability to have a clean transactional behavior and a good experience while doing so. And let's face it, most of the time what we're trying to do is authenticate so we can shop and spend money. And now suddenly the digital economy starts to slow down just a little bit. So what I would offer, and Human has gone down this path, is that there's actually a series of activities that allows you to have a better understanding of what's going on in your digital environment, not just at the end of the activity, but throughout the entire life cycle of your digital client experience. And the reality is that you're doing so much, much earlier on than when you get to that CAPTCHA challenge that slows you down and adds friction to your environment in the first place. So what you see here is kind of a really unique view, and I would offer it's a view that you're not going to really see with any other security tools, because we created a company that brought together two completely disparate views into this much broader digital economy scenario. And that starts with interacting with the digital ad or digital ad content itself as it's produced. So as security professionals, I know myself as one, I had no clue that there was a whole other ecosystem happening in the digital world that had a perfectly good overlay into the fraudulent space. So allow me for just a second to tell you a little bit about it. So as digital ad content is created, and it gets placed everywhere from a website to inside of a connected device, inside of a connected TV scenario, inside of a gaming environment, in a mobile application, those ads basically fill a specific demographic. That demographic could be, hypothetically, McDonald's wakes up one day and says, I want to put an ad for Big Macs in front of eyeballs 24 to 25 years of age in New York City on a Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Okay, sounds good. So what they do is they go into an environment and say, who has ad space available that fits that demographic? CNN.com raises its hand. Well, at that time, McDonald's doesn't get to just put their information into CNN.com, because it turns out that American Airlines, Wells Fargo, and Condé Nast all have that same desire to put digital ad content in that same place. And so what happens? An auction starts to occur. And this micro auction gets hosted inside of environments like platforms inside of Microsoft or Google or Amazon, or what would be known as the Trade Desk, which is an ad platform or a DSP, a digital supply platform that allows you to marry up what the advertisers have as a need and what publishers or hosting environments have as digital space, and an auction occurs. Well, that auction happens billions of times a day all over the world, and transactions have to happen within that digital environment in tenths of a millisecond to decide, is this good digital content or bad digital content? Is this the right digital content or the wrong digital content? And is bot activity coming in to manipulate that scenario? Two things happen. Number one, the auction price that occurs at that very moment in time starts to get manipulated by fraudulent activity coming in. Now, for all of us that protect environments, if your company publishes an ad at any point, they're probably going through this process, but it's not something that your security organization gets directly engaged on, but they should, because now what you're doing is you're dealing with your brand reputation, and you're dealing with massive amounts of fraudulent activity that occurs. The second thing that occurs, besides manipulating that digital fraud environment or that digital auction environment and the pricing associated with it, is that there's a lot of both first and third party data around the demographics of the people that you're marrying the digital ad content to that would actually see it. Fraudsters in the tens of thousands, in the millions, are coming in and just harvesting that information and stealing it to manipulate it. That's all happening on the left-hand side of this equation here. While that's happening, ideally, the auction occurs, an ad is placed, and all is good in the world. Now that that ad is placed, what do? An individual, a customer, comes in and interfaces with that ad. When they interface with that ad, again, there's a scenario where there's a monetization event for fraudsters to be able to create click fraud scenarios or to create malicious redirect scenarios to be able to take you to areas where they might have malicious hosting of content. It could be redirect for drive-by scenarios. It could be infrastructure for phishing campaigns, or it could just be straight up fraud to be able to drive up the number of clicks that happen, which becomes fraud against each of your marketing teams and departments and your advertising budgets. We're sitting there in the middle of that transactional behavior, trying to prevent that activity from happening at any kind of mass or scale from bot scenarios. Now, once those two things have happened, let's say hypothetically you made it through a bid process, your ad gets published, you attract individuals, an individual comes and sees it, they like it, all is good in the world. Now, what did they do? Ideally, they click on that ad and they go into your application layer. At that application layer, you now have a scenario where there's going to be all kinds of checks and balances to make sure that the code that's running at that particular time from a client-side perspective is effective and appropriate. And now they do the thing that matters most, which is they go in and they start to establish an account. At the account level, one of the key components that you're trying to accomplish at this point is to make sure that the authentication occurs and that there hasn't been an account takeover. Once that account takeover has been eliminated and an individual is able to authenticate properly, they have the entitlements and rights that allow them to actually do the thing they need to do, which in this case could be setting up an affinity program relationship or going shopping in a digital shopping cart, and now they need to go and check out, and now there's a whole set of fraudulent activity that could occur at the next layer down inside of the account around transactional fraud that could occur. Each one of these steps is something that Human is helping to look for a very specific set of behavioral infrastructure and historical components that allows you to triangulate very, very quickly where there is or isn't fraud happening, where there is or isn't bot-based amplification occurring that could create that fraudulent outcome at scale. The real art and the science of all of this isn't just the bringing together of these seemingly disparate interactions to be able to make these point-in-time decisions, but to do it much earlier in the life cycle. So if you can imagine a scenario, and this is actually what we're working on day in and day out with our clients today, is that if you were bad when you checked out at your favorite digital retailer of choice at the end of this process yesterday, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to be bad when you first interface with the digital ad content that attracted you to that brand tomorrow on a completely different environment. And there becomes this need to build a persistent identifier that transcends the deprecation of cookies and the removal of other PII-based activities in all the appropriate scenarios to protect our individual protections, to be able to look for activity that is more likely than not to be bad much earlier in the fraudulent life cycle. Now, all of this becomes really, really important because what we're really here to do, whether you're in fraud, whether you're in risk, whether you're in advertising, or whether you're in security, is to make sure that your business is allowed to accomplish the transactions that it expects to accomplish in a way that's normal and accurate for that business. So what are we really trying to do? We take this knowledge that we've gained through being present throughout the entirety of this life cycle and apply it to almost like a squelch knob, create just enough friction to either identify, slow down, or disassociate the malicious actors with the activity that they're trying to create and impose cost much, much further to the left in the life cycle that they're doing it. And that, in a nutshell, is a much more modern way of thinking about how to mitigate the impacts of the bot activity at scale inside of these environments, rather than waiting until the end to start at the beginning, use the knowledge to add friction every single step of the way by tying together two environments that you normally don't think of. When you tie together your digital ad environment and your digital presence with your end state results at the account scenarios. So I'm coming up on time already, so I'm not going to get to some of the other juicy stuff that I was going to talk about, but I'll go ahead and pause there and just see if there are any questions or comments, and look forward to having future conversation. Yes?
I'm not entirely too sure, but is there a way that if, I guess, a malicious actor manipulate like a time to live, or I guess mimic human
Absolutely.
activity? Is there a way where y'all can be able to kind of mitigate that a little bit or figure that out?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I didn't talk about here, I might, let's see. So yeah, here's probably a good example, and not the best example, but the bottom line is that there's different kinds of like CAPTCHA challenges that are very often manipulated by malicious actors. And one of the ways that historically people have gone around CAPTCHA is we say, instead of selecting the picture, the crosswalk, the bike, why don't you go ahead and trace this shape, or move this puzzle piece, or connect the dots between 2 points. And that requires what's perceived to be a human taking some kind of cognitive action as a result. The reality is that those are easily defeated as well, because you can just code your way into finding those patterns and then working through them. So there's additional ways to start to move around that. But the idea that a human-based action is the only way to be able to discern between a human and a bot, that's unfortunately gone by the wayside. Yes, please.
So it kind of seems like I don't kind of notice this with a lot of new technologies when it's like 3D printing and like certain things where like we basically want computers to do all of these easy tasks.
Yeah.
And so eventually what are some other ways you verify that bots aren't bots? Because, the capture isn't always going to work because we don't want to capture. We want to
That's
do
right.
other tasks.
No, you're exactly right. Look, there's a really difficult scenario, particularly when you get into this environment, when you look at some of the uses of bots. We all use bots every day, right? I mean, heck, I've got my customer service organization, as they're interfacing with their clients, has used all kinds of bots to work between our customer success organization, our Slack environment, and the way that we interface with people. Perfectly normal scenario with bots. But it gets much more complicated when you start to get into some businesses. So for instance, if you get into a travel website or a ticketing website, they're going to use bots all the time to be able to make sure that they're constantly refreshing their understanding of the pricing schemas around their tickets and that they're always available in the right way. It's inherently positive for them to be able to deploy bots to do that, but inherently negative to have bots that manipulate the prices in the wrong direction. So there's this conflict of interest associated with it the entire time. I think that the biggest challenge is exactly the one that you're identifying, which is it's not just about a very binary decision of bot or not. It's good bot or bad bot. And then, by the way, it's not just human or not, it's good human or bad human, right human or wrong human. And now you get into a much more triangulated conversation that needs to happen. And that's why tying together all of the behaviors into a cluster of patterns that really kind of bring together, like I said, the infrastructure, the behaviors, the historical activity, and then also known bad indicators just around some of those behavioral patterns into a grouping or clustering is what allows you to make that decision. The hard part is you have the data to do it, and you have the speed to do it effectively and consistently every time. All right, well, my teammates and I are here in the audience, and we'd love to chat further and give you some more stories and also just help point you in the right direction. I appreciate your time today, and thank you so much.